My own family locked me in the basement and waited for the flood to drown me. The rain had been relentless all week. It pounded the roof, rattled the windows, and carved tiny rivers along the gutters. I sat in my old recliner, the one that sagged under my weight like it remembered every hardship I had ever endured, and listened to the steady drumming. The evening news flickered in the background. The river behind our house was rising faster than anyone expected, and flood warnings had been issued for our county. I thought about calling my children, but I knew better. They were too busy. My son, always impatient, had muttered last week that I was too old to keep track of anything and should just leave the house to them someday. My daughter had promised she'd help when the storm hit, but her promises had always been empty. I didn't trust them, not really, but I had no one else. By the time the evening shadows stretched across the living room, the wind had picked up. Tree branches scraped against the windows like fingernails against a chalkboard. The smell of wet earth mixed with the faint scent of mildew in the basement. I felt a chill run down my spine, not from the cold, but from memory. Decades ago, when I was a young woman, my father had taught me survival tricks during a flood that hit our small hometown. I had climbed furniture, tied ropes to beams, and used hollow spaces to breathe when water rose. I remembered it all now, tucked somewhere in the folds of my mind like a map I wasn't sure I'd ever need again. Then the storm knocked a branch off the oak tree outside, slamming it against the roof. I jumped. My children appeared at the top of the stairs moments later, drenched and frantic, carrying boxes and bags. My son's voice was sharp. "Mom, you need to go downstairs. It's safer there." Safer? That word cut me like a knife. I wanted to ask why he hadn't taken the boxes to the neighbors' high ground or why they weren't helping me evacuate. But the look in their eyes froze my tongue. They were too eager, too calculating. I shuffled to the basement door, using my cane for support. The air smelled damp and sour, and the light flickered overhead. My daughter handed me a flashlight, her hand brushing mine with a touch that felt practiced, rehearsed. "You'll be fine," she said. I took a hesitant step down. The stairs creaked under my weight. Then click. The basement door locked behind me. At first I thought it was an accident. My heart pounded, the familiar panic of confinement wrapping around me. "Who did that?" I called, my voice echoing against the concrete walls. No answer, just the patter of rain and the distant roar of the river. Footsteps retreated upstairs, fading into the storm. My hands shook. I tried the doorknob. Nothing. I banged on it, still nothing. Then the whispers came, soft and almost casual. "We can say we didn't know. Better this way. Don't look back. Just go." The realization hit me like ice water. They hadn't forgotten me. They had left me here. Panic clawed at my chest. The air was thick, wet, and heavy with the smell of old cement. Water began to seep under the door, thin streams at first, almost playful. But the streams grew, pooling at my feet, cold and relentless. My old bones ached as I tried to stay calm, tried to think. I remembered my father's advice during that long-ago flood. Always find the highest point. Make yourself small. Breathe slow. Don't let fear drown you. I searched the basement, scanning the shadows. Broken chairs, a discarded table, stacks of old boxes. Furniture that had long been relegated to the corners of the house now became my lifeline. I pulled a chair over, wedged it against the wall, climbed atop it, and used the table as another step. My body shivered, exhausted but alive. The water was creeping higher. My hands slipped, my arms ached, and my heart threatened to burst. I shoved and kicked at debris, breaking boards, tying cords around pipes, making rope ladders where none existed. Every movement was a gamble, every breath a victory. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time became meaningless. The basement was a cage, a tomb, a trial I had to endure. Memories of my children's small cruelties, the way they had mocked my frailty, the nights they ignored my cries, came flooding back. And yet the survival instinct was sharper than any betrayal. Then I found the old window, its glass partially broken from years of neglect. With what little strength remained, I pried it open and squeezed through. The wind hit me like a wall, rain lashing against my face. I tumbled into the street, water up to my waist, shivering, gasping. Sirens wailed in the distance. Neighbors were helping each other to higher ground. I pulled myself along the edge of the road, each step a mixture of agony and triumph. The flood hadn't killed me. Not yet. By the time the rescue team found me, I was a mess of mud, bruises, and exhaustion. But my eyes were sharp. My mind was clear. And inside, a fire had started. One that my children could not imagine. They thought they had destroyed me. They thought the river would take me away. But rivers do not drown a woman who knows how to survive. Rivers only remind you of the strength you carry. That night, as I lay in the hospital bed wrapped in blankets, I made a vow. I would not forget. I would not forgive. And when the time was right, I would reclaim every stolen piece of my life. I survived that night, but the real storm was just beginning. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and despair. The rhythmic beep of the monitors and the distant chatter of nurses became a strange lullaby. I lay in that sterile bed, bruised, shivering, and half-drenched in a memory that refused to let me go. Outside, the storm had passed, but inside me, the storm raged on. Doctors called it a miracle that I had survived. The neighbors whispered about how the river spared her this time. My children visited, their faces pale and apologetic, or so they tried to make me believe. But I had learned to read the language of their eyes long ago. Behind every forced smile and tremor of concern was calculation, self-interest, and indifference. My daughter hovered near my bedside, wringing her hands. "Mom, we were so worried. I thought we might lose you." Her voice trembled, but her eyes betrayed the same thought I had been afraid to see for decades. She expected me to be weak, broken, and grateful. My son's approach was more blatant. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, jaw tight. "You had us scared," he said. "We didn't think you'd make it." I studied him carefully. Every word, every hesitation, every inflection revealed his guilt, and the relief that he wasn't going to be questioned yet for leaving me to drown. I lay there quietly, pretending weakness, swallowing the bile of betrayal. I let them speak, let them vent their fears and apologies, let them bask in the illusion of control. Inside, my mind was already working, turning over every memory, every slight, every moment of cruelty they had visited upon me. The basement was only the latest in a lifetime of betrayals. During the first nights in the hospital, I thought about how easily people can overlook the frail, the elderly, the supposedly powerless. I thought about every insult my children had thrown at me over the years. Too slow, too old, too sensitive, too much trouble. They had believed their cruelty was hidden behind love, necessity, or indifference. But I had learned to remember. I remembered the time my son had taken my savings account and used it to invest in some foolproof scheme, leaving me scrambling to pay the bills. I remembered my daughter mocking my cooking, my clothes, my advice, all the way into adulthood, laughing while I tried to endure. I remembered my husband, long dead, who had abandoned me for another life while I raised my children alone, scraping pennies and swallowing insults. Now, lying in this hospital bed, I realized the flood hadn't just spared me, it had given me clarity. The physical pain was sharp, yes, but the mental clarity was sharper. I could see the threads of my life, tangled by deceit and betrayal, and for the first time in decades, I could trace the pattern clearly. The nurses were kind enough, though unaware of the tension they walked among. One of them, a young woman named Marcy, noticed the bruises, the way my eyes flickered with anger beneath my fatigue. She asked gently, "Did your family?" I shook my head ever so slightly. Some truths, I thought, cannot be trusted to anyone, not yet. During the long nights, I started keeping track. Every conversation, every gesture, every hint of greed or impatience. My children had underestimated me. They had assumed survival would make me weak, grateful, pliable. They were wrong. The hospital stay was long and grueling. My body ached from the cold, from the climbing, from the water that had tried to claim me. But with every step toward recovery, my mind grew sharper. I made mental lists of accounts, investments, hidden debts, and secrets. Everything they thought they could control without my interference. One night, when the ward was quiet, I found a corner of the hospital balcony where I could watch the town's streetlights glint off the puddles left by the flood. The town looked peaceful from above, unaware of the storm that had raged in my basement, unaware of the storm that was about to rise within me. I remembered a line from a novel I had read long ago. Justice does not require a sword, it requires patience. I would need patience. I would need subtlety. I would need the cunning that only comes from decades of surviving people who believe themselves smarter, faster, stronger than you. By the time I was discharged, my mind had become a ledger of revenge and reclamation. My children thought I would return home, grateful for their attention, weak and forgiving. They would be mistaken. I returned to the house cautiously. The flood had damaged much of the lower floor, but nothing had been stolen. Not that it mattered. Their thefts had already been catalogued in my memory. I went room by room, noting which items held value, which documents revealed secrets, which corners concealed their lies. Every detail mattered. Every overlooked moment was a piece of leverage. I had become quiet, almost ghost-like in my own home. I spoke little, observed more. My children tried to resume their normal interactions with me, bringing groceries, asking after my health, pretending all was well. Each time I responded politely, quietly, masking the storm that churned beneath my calm exterior. And then I discovered something extraordinary. While my children had been panicked about the flood and about their property, they had left several documents unprotected, records of financial manipulations, secret bank accounts, and a series of emails revealing their indifference to me during the storm. Proof. Tangible, undeniable proof. For the first time, I felt the faint taste of power return to my mouth. Not physical strength, not brute force, but the strength that comes from knowledge, from patience, from watching people underestimate you. I would not confront them recklessly. That was not my style. I would strike carefully, strategically. Their arrogance would be their undoing. Over the following weeks, I recovered my body, slowly walking the house, cleaning, repairing, preparing. But my mind was the real instrument of survival. Every smile I gave, every nod, every expression of weakness was calculated. Every gesture of frailty was a mask, hiding the fire that now burned with a clear purpose: justice. And as the sun rose higher each day, drying the remnants of the flood, I realized something crucial. The flood had not just spared me, it had awakened me. The world thought I had been defeated, humiliated, and left to die. But in truth, I had been given a second chance, and I would use it. They laughed at me, until I found what they thought was buried forever. The morning sunlight fell gently across the living room, but it brought no warmth to me. I had learned long ago that the calm outside often hid storms within. The house was quiet, almost sterile after the flood, with only the faint smell of damp carpet lingering. My children went about their lives, thinking I was fragile, grateful, and compliant. But that morning, as I brewed my coffee and sipped it slowly, I knew they had underestimated me. Again. I began methodically. First, the cabinets where bills and documents were kept. Every envelope, every folder, every hidden slip of paper I had once overlooked became a treasured trove of information. I examined bank statements, tax forms, investment papers. My hands shook slightly, not from weakness but anticipation. They had thought my years of careful bookkeeping had been useless. They had been wrong. I found proof that my son had siphoned funds from my accounts, hiding them behind shell corporations. Small amounts at first, imperceptible to anyone not paying attention. But over time, substantial enough to affect my life, my comfort, my security. And the audacity he had never considered I might notice. Next, the emails. Oh, the emails. My daughter's contemptuous messages about me, her mocking tone, the casual references to leaving me to deal with the old lady's stuff, all preserved in her digital correspondence. She had believed her cleverness and distance made her invisible, untouchable. She had misjudged me. I sat at the old dining table, sorting documents into piles. Lies, thefts, betrayals, and potential leverage. Each pile was a monument to the years of suffering I had endured. The basement had been the latest cruelty, but these stacks reminded me that the flood was only the overt act. The subtler betrayals were far more dangerous, because they had gone unnoticed for decades. The memories came back in waves. My son's sharp words when I asked for help with my taxes. my daughter's laughter at my stumbling attempts to adapt to new technology. My husband, long gone, who had left me to raise 2 children on a salary that barely covered rent. Every slight, every insult, every instance of neglect now became fuel. I studied each moment as if it were a piece on a chessboard, considering how each could be used, how each could be leveraged to reclaim what had been stolen from me. Not just money, but dignity, respect, and control. At night, I prowled the house quietly, listening. My children spoke openly to each other, believing I was asleep or too weak to understand. They planned vacations with money I had earned, joked about properties I had once owned, and discussed investments made in my name. I recorded everything. My old smartphone became my silent accomplice, capturing their voices, their words, their arrogance. I also began to reconnect with the town's history. I had lived here for over 50 years, and there were people who remembered my family, my struggles, my contributions. I visited neighbors under the guise of casual visits, asking about minor events, gathering bits of information. Sometimes it was a whispered story about a loan my children had mismanaged, sometimes a comment about my son's failed business deal, sometimes a quiet recollection of my daughter's manipulations. Each scrap of information fit into the larger puzzle of betrayal. The process was slow, painstaking. I had to be patient. Every time I stumbled upon something new, an account number, an email, a forgotten contract, I felt a pulse of vindication. I cataloged everything meticulously, creating a record that would one day expose every lie, every theft, every calculated cruelty. I even revisited my father's survival lessons, not for the flood this time, but for the metaphorical storms. How he had taught me to observe, to plan, to use patience as a weapon. I realized that my family had never accounted for that part of me. The cunning, strategic side that had kept me alive during the flood, that had survived decades of emotional warfare. And then came the discovery that changed everything. Hidden in a dusty filing cabinet was a ledger my son had carelessly left behind. It detailed transfers of funds, hidden accounts, and transactions made in my name without my knowledge. The scale of it was staggering, but not insurmountable. I smiled quietly, sipping my coffee. The flood had not only spared me physically, it had awakened me. I spent hours cross-referencing the ledger with other documents, emails, and notes I had taken over the past weeks. Patterns emerged, a network of deceit, greed, and betrayal, all interconnected, all tied to my children's belief that I was powerless. And that belief was my advantage. In the evenings, I would sit by the window, watching the town settle after the flood, the streets still wet, the riverbanks glistening in the fatting sun. People had returned to normal, unaware that a storm had raged in my home, and that another storm was quietly forming in my mind. I was planning, calculating, preparing for a reckoning they would never see coming. Even small details mattered. A misplaced contract, an overlooked payment, a casual boast to a friend, all became threads I could pull. I started imagining the sequence, how to reveal their misdeeds, how to ensure the consequences hit precisely where it would hurt the most. The goal was not violence. Violence would be crude, obvious. This had to be elegant, surgical, undeniable. Night after night, I reviewed my findings. Every act of cruelty became a stepping stone. Every insult, every slight, every moment they assumed they had power over me was documented, catalogued, and ready to be used. I was no longer the grandmother they thought I was. I had survived the flood, yes, but I had also survived decades of betrayal. And survival had taught me the most important lesson. Patience is more dangerous than anger. By the time I lay down to sleep, exhaustion finally claiming me, I felt a strange calm. The flood had taken nothing of my mind, my spirit, or my capacity for strategy. I had a plan forming, a plan that would strip away their arrogance, their confidence, their sense of safety. I would take back everything they had taken from me, and I would do it without lifting a hand in anger. The flood had been a beginning. The real storm was just forming inside me. They thought I was broken. They would soon regret every cruel word. The house felt different now. Not because of the flood, not because of the repairs, but because I moved through it differently. My steps were deliberate, my eyes sharp, my presence calm yet heavy with intent. My children went about their routines, convinced I was still fragile, still compliant. that illusion would be their undoing. I began with small, seemingly innocuous gestures. A casual comment at the dinner table about an overdue bill. A whispered question about a forgotten bank statement. My daughter froze mid-sip of her coffee, her mind racing to recall if she had hidden anything. My son's jaw tightened, a subtle tic I had seen many times before. Their reactions were the proof I needed. They knew I was watching, that I remembered, that I understood. I leveraged what I had gathered over the past weeks. Each piece of evidence became a quiet weapon. Emails, ledgers, accounts, photographs, all carefully documented, cross-referenced, and stored in a hidden folder on my laptop. I never let them see me accessing it. I never let them suspect the extent of my awareness. Then came the first act of subtle exposure. I left a copy of an old bank statement, carefully highlighted, on the kitchen counter where my daughter would inevitably see it. She picked it up, eyes widening, a faint tremor in her hands. I poured myself a cup of tea, watched her, and smiled faintly. She thought I had made a mistake. I had not. Next, I began reaching out quietly to those who had unknowingly been part of their schemes. Old neighbors, former colleagues, even distant relatives. I framed my inquiries as casual curiosity, concern, or shared nostalgia. But each conversation pulled a thread, unraveling lies and exposing secrets that my children believed were buried forever. I documented every detail, every slip of the tongue, every careless admission, every hesitation was noted. Their arrogance became my advantage. They assumed that age had dulled my mind, that my body made me harmless, that their manipulations were invisible. How wrong they were. The first real tension surfaced when my daughter found a letter tucked inside an old cookbook. A copy of a contract she had signed years ago without my knowledge. She confronted me in a low, nervous voice, trying to sound casual, but the tremor betrayed her. "Mom, I don't know how this got here." I smiled, letting a hint of calm patience mask the fire within. "Oh, I just came across it while cleaning," I said softly, letting my words hang in the air. The power in that moment was subtle, but absolute. She realized without me saying a word that I knew. My son tried a different approach. He brought up trivialities, questions about property, investments, even family vacations. He tried to gauge if I was weak, if I had noticed discrepancies, if I would challenge him. I answered politely, carefully, never revealing my knowledge, only hinting at it. He left each conversation uneasy, unsure what I knew and what I would reveal. That uncertainty was the first step in dismantling their confidence. The psychological effect was immediate. My children became tentative around me, second-guessing their words, their actions. Every casual boast, every careless lie, was now a potential trap. I let it happen, patiently observing, cataloging, and waiting for the right moment to turn their arrogance against them. I also began to subtly reclaim my space in the house. I rearranged furniture, moved objects, and displayed photos that reminded them of my authority and history. Each act was symbolic, a silent assertion that I was still here, still in control, still powerful in ways they had forgotten. At night, I reviewed the evidence, making connections, noting patterns, and planning the sequence of revelations. Each document, each email, each ledger became a piece of a larger strategy. I imagined the precise reactions, the guilt, the fear, and the inevitable reckoning. One evening, my daughter came into the living room, holding a folder of receipts she had hurriedly collected. "Mom, I found these. I think you might be concerned about them," she said, trying to maintain a casual tone. I looked at her, expression serene, and nodded slowly. "Yes, I am concerned, but only because I want to understand everything clearly," I replied, voice soft, almost gentle. Her hands shook slightly as she placed the folder on the table. I watched her, seeing the fear flicker across her face, the realization that I had been aware, all along, of her manipulations. She had underestimated my patience, my intelligence, and my ability to observe. My son approached later that night, attempting to dominate the conversation with aggressive questioning, trying to assert authority over me. But I stayed calm, answering each question with precision and neutrality. His frustration grew, evident in his clenched fists and strained voice. By the time he left the room, I could almost hear the small fracture in his confidence forming, a crack that would widen with every passing day. It was in these quiet, deliberate actions that my revenge began. No violence, no confrontation. Just subtle, precise movements that destabilize them, expose their weaknesses, and force them to confront the consequences of their own cruelty. And as I sat in the dim light of the living room, sipping tea and reviewing my notes, I realized something powerful. They had never truly seen me. Not really. They had never recognized my resilience, my cunning, or the depth of my patience. They had assumed survival would be enough to make me compliant. But survival had only been the beginning. The flood had been a test, and I had passed. The real storm was now forming, quietly, methodically, within me. Each day brought new opportunities. A misplaced document, a careless comment, an overlooked transaction, each was a thread I could pull, and I intended to pull them all. Slowly, elegantly, without lifting a hand in anger. The quiet revenge had begun, and it would be unstoppable. I didn't need to hurt them. They had already buried themselves. By the time the confrontation began, the house had grown quiet in a way that felt almost ritualistic. I had spent weeks preparing, not with weapons, not with anger, but with precision, patience, and evidence. Every document, every email, every recorded conversation, every small slip of arrogance my children had made over decades had been carefully preserved. My daughter came in first, attempting to maintain her usual composure. "Mom, we need to talk," she said, her voice tight, rehearsed. She believed she was in control, that I would remain passive, pliable. She had no idea what had been happening behind the calm, observing eyes of the woman she thought she had subdued. I gestured for her to sit. Calm, deliberate, unthreatening. And then I laid out the first piece of evidence. A copy of the ledger she had thought was hidden, highlighting the transfers she had made from my accounts without permission. I watched as her expression shifted from casual confidence to disbelief, to panic. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found it while cleaning," I said softly, letting each word hang in the air. I leaned back, sipping my tea, watching her unravel. It was subtle at first. My daughter tried to deny it, claiming mistakes, oversight, miscommunication. But I countered each excuse with proof, emails, bank statements, and corroborating notes I had meticulously collected. Her voice grew louder, more desperate, but she could not escape the weight of evidence. Then my son entered, unaware of the precise timing of my confrontation. He tried to dominate the discussion, to intimidate with anger and forceful words. But the calm, deliberate tone in my voice, the clarity of the evidence laid before him, and the unexpected composure in my eyes, caused a hesitation he had not anticipated. "Mom, this isn't fair," he said, his voice cracking. "We've been doing what we thought was right. Doing what was right," I interrupted, calm but firm. "Leaving me in the basement during the flood was right. Siphoning my savings was right. Mocking me, disregarding my life and my efforts was right." The room grew tense. My words were not loud, but they carried a weight that could not be denied. My children exchanged glances, the confidence they had carried for decades beginning to crumble. I presented each betrayal methodically. Every theft, every insult, every act of indifference during the flood and before. I let each accusation land fully, giving them time to realize the enormity of their actions. Their defenses faltered, then broke. Tears, stammered words, and long silences filled the room. "You think you can intimidate me with anger," I said quietly, "but I have spent decades observing, learning, surviving. You assumed weakness, but weakness does not survive floods, and it does not survive betrayal. Patience survives, intelligence survives, and now so does justice." For the first time, my children truly saw me. Not the frail grandmother they had mocked, not the woman they had left to die, not the easy target they had assumed I would be. They saw the clarity, the precision, and the depth of my patience. They saw the force of decades of survival. And they understood, in a single horrifying moment, that they had underestimated me completely. My daughter collapsed into a chair, sobbing quietly, unable to form words. My son stood stiffly, fists clenched, voice trembling as he tried to speak. But each excuse, each justification, crumbled beneath the weight of the evidence I had laid out. I watched them struggle with guilt, fear, and disbelief. I did not need to yell. I did not need to strike. The reckoning had come through their own actions, their own arrogance. I had orchestrated it quietly, patiently, with precision. Hours passed as we went through the details one by one. Every document, every ledger, every email confirmed their betrayals. My children could not deny what they had done. And as the room fell silent again, I realized the depth of the transformation. Not in me, but in them. The arrogance, the indifference, the cruelty that had defined their relationship with me was gone, replaced by shame, guilt, and a new awareness of who I truly was. Finally, I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street still wet from the flood. The quiet strength I had cultivated over decades settled in my bones. I turned back to them, calm, unwavering. "I survived the flood," I said softly. "But more importantly, I survived you. And now, perhaps, you will begin to understand the consequences of your actions." My daughter whispered, barely audible, We didn't know." "You did," I replied, steady, cold, precise. "You just assumed I wouldn't notice, and that was your first mistake." The confrontation left them shaken, humbled, and aware of a power they had long ignored. It was not mercy that held me back, it was patience. The reckoning had arrived, quietly, elegantly, without the need for anger or violence. That night, as I sat alone in the dim light of the living room, I realized the truth. Revenge had not needed to be loud. It had only needed to be meticulous, deliberate, and patient. They had buried themselves long before the flood. They had built their own downfall, and all I had done was reveal it. For the first time in decades, I felt a deep, lasting calm. The storm inside me had transformed into something steady, unstoppable, and serene. I had survived betrayal, endured cruelty, and reclaimed my power, not through force, but through observation, patience, and intelligence. They tried to drown me. All they did was make me unstoppable. The house was quiet now, truly quiet. No arguments, no pretenses, no hurried footsteps. The flood had long receded from the streets outside, leaving puddles and mud, but it had also left a mark inside the walls of my home and in the hearts of my children. They walked carefully now, measured their words, and avoided my gaze. The reckoning had left its scars, visible and invisible. I moved through the house like a ghost, surveying the spaces I had once felt powerless in. The basement no longer held fear for me. It held memory and a lesson, a reminder of the night my children had attempted to erase me and the strength that had carried me through. Every corner, every shadow was a testament to survival, endurance, and patience. Weeks turned into months. My children attempted to rebuild their confidence, to restore some semblance of normalcy, but it was gone. The arrogance that had once defined them had been stripped away. I watched quietly as they navigated the consequences of their actions. Financial scrutiny, legal oversight, the judgment of neighbors who had quietly learned of the betrayals. I never had to speak loudly or threaten. The evidence had spoken, and it had spoken decisively. I returned to the river one late afternoon. The water was calm, deceptively serene, reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. I walked along the bank, the memory of the flood night pressing gently against my consciousness. I remembered the icy water seeping under the basement door, the panic that had gripped me, and the determination that had saved me. The river, which had once threatened to claim my life, now seemed like a mirror of my resilience, rising, relentless, unstoppable. In the quiet of my home, I began to reclaim the things that had been taken from me. Not just the money, not just the property, but the intangible dignity and respect that my children had thought could be trampled without consequence. I re-established connections in the community, revisited friendships that had grown distant, and quietly ensured that my legacy, my story, would not be buried or forgotten. My children adapted as best they could. My son, who had once been brash and dismissive, now approached conversations with caution, humility coloring his voice. My daughter, who had mocked and belittled me for years, now showed a tentative respect, still awkward, still uneasy, but unmistakably present. The lessons they had learned were harsh and irreversible. And yet, the most profound change was within me. I no longer carried the fear that had been a constant companion for decades. I no longer doubted my strength, my wit, or my capacity to endure. The flood had tested me, and my children had underestimated me. Both trials had reinforced a truth I had always known. Survival is not merely about living, it is about mastering the circumstances, mastering the people around you, and mastering oneself. Even in the evenings, as I sat by the window sipping tea, I found peace in reflection. The flood had cleansed more than just the streets. It had cleansed the hidden corners of my life where fear, betrayal, and frustration had festered. My children had been forced to confront the consequences of their cruelty, but I had also been forced to confront mine. The years spent enduring, the silent suffering, and the quiet resilience that had carried me through. I did not seek vengeance for the sake of anger. I sought justice for myself, for the dignity that had been denied me for so long. And in that pursuit, I found a strange serenity. I had survived every storm, literal and metaphorical, and emerged not broken, but refined. The final reckoning did not arrive in a dramatic confrontation. It arrived quietly, in the subtle shifts in my children's behavior, in the acknowledgement of their mistakes, in the restoration of my autonomy and power. The flood had been the beginning, the aftermath had been the process, and now, in the stillness of my home and life, the story had reached its conclusion. I often sit in my recliner in the evenings, watching the sun dip below the horizon, and I remember the night the flood threatened to drown me. I remember the icy water, the rising panic, the sense of betrayal, and the clarity that followed. And I smile, not out of cruelty, but out of triumph. The triumph of survival, patience, and quiet justice. For those who might attempt to harm me, to dismiss me, to betray me, there is a lesson to be learned. The storms you think will destroy someone may instead awaken them. The flood did not kill me, it strengthened me. My children tried to erase me, but all they did was forge me into a force they could not recognize, a power they could not undo, and a presence they could never ignore. They tried to drown me. All they did was make me unstoppable,